The jurisdiction I'm going to talk about is particularly Wales, but within the context of the wider UK. The UK context is quite different relative to the rest of the world in a right to housing, in that we have legally enforceable rights at the individual or the household level. In most countries, that's not the case. You have a right to housing, but it's very difficult to gain access to that right at the individual level. In Wales, what we've done and what we've introduced is a right to reasonable assistance at the point at which somebody is at risk of becoming homeless. So it is a right to housing, but it's a right that is enforced at the point of crisis. And the way in which that works is that if somebody is at risk of losing their home, then they can approach their local authority, and that local authority is under a legal duty to take reasonable steps to try and help that person either stay where they are or find alternative accommodation. And if the local authority doesn't take those steps, then that person, that household, can seek redress through the courts, and that's really quite rare. So the legislation is intended to work with all types of household and all risks of homelessness. And that means giving consideration to subgroups of the population like young people. For young people, when the legislation was developed, what we did is look particularly at the risk factors of youth homelessness. And the primary risk factor is conflict within the family and then the young person being asked to leave. And so it was intended in the legislation that the reasonable steps that a local authority might take with a young person and their family would be around family mediation, of which those services already existed in Wales and across the UK. And the legislation was intended to make sure that that was available to everybody when it was appropriate. And it's not to say that the young person will always remain at home. Sometimes the most sustainable solution is a planned exit, but it's certainly about avoiding an unplanned exit and the trajectory that then follows. So that was the main area of work in which the legislation was intended to work with young people. So when a household is at risk of homelessness, and we use a very, very broad definition of risk of homelessness, the broadest. When somebody's at risk of homelessness, they do need to make an approach to the local authority. That is a challenge. You know, we're not necessarily going out to find folk. When they've made an approach to the local authority has 56 days to work with that person. So arguably in line with ideas around rapid rehousing and rapid solutions, you've got 56 days to take reasonable steps to prevent or relieve homelessness. And those 56 days and those reasonable steps vary. It was intended to be really centered on the needs of the household. And in practice, what happens is there's a housing plan is made, and that is supposed to listen to the needs of the household, talk about what's available within the authority, and then you come to a set of steps that the local authority will take. And those can include things like perhaps the household has run into rent arrears and they're being threatened with eviction because of that, in which case it's about covering the rent arrears. Or as we talked about, if it's a young person facing a conflict in the household, it can be family mediation, or it might be a short stay outside of the family home before a return, and then eventually potentially a planned move, or they remain. It could be, as we've seen in other cases, that simply a household is making a move and they don't have the finances to get the facilities that are needed, the equipment, whatever, the white goods. It can cover things like that. It basically can cover whatever's needed to prevent homelessness or relieve homelessness. Now, in reality, there are some problems with the way that's being implemented. Some local authorities are using the pathway plan, the housing plan, to identify steps that they would expect of the household to take, and moving away from duties on the local authority to making expectations on steps that the household will take. And that's not as it was intended. So there are definitely problems with implementation that we need to recognise. So, a typical right to housing as would exist elsewhere would imagine that you're basically under a due regard in other policy areas to give due regard to people's housing situation. So you don't bring in a land policy or a welfare policy that has detrimental impacts on people's access to adequate, affordable housing. In the UK context, the legislation is quite different because it's a legally enforceable right at the individual level, but it has many of the same challenges. So what we've got is that the duty, in Wales at least, is placed on the local authority. And the local authority then largely places that within a housing department. And so homelessness and a right to housing gets seen as a housing issue. And that's a problem, because we know that for many households, including young people, the journeys into homelessness and housing precarity come through other systems. So whether that's through an education system that's failing, through a criminal justice system that is leading to homelessness, through a health system, and all those other policy domains. And actually, we failed in Wales. We recognise that challenge, but we failed to legislate on these other areas, even though we talked about corporate duties on local authorities. Now, the interesting thing is England learnt on the failings of Wales, and they introduced a duty to refer on some of these other public bodies, on prisons and others, so that we were able to identify people at risk of homelessness earlier and prevent homelessness. And now Scotland are looking to learn from Wales and England, and they're intending to place an ask and act duty on their other public bodies, so that they're not only referring, but they're actually under a duty to act to prevent. And this is the journey that we've gone on, and devolution in the UK has given us this natural experiment conditions where we see this policy mobility within the UK, and it really is moving beyond just housing. And within a right to housing, the main challenge is enforcement of that legislative direction. So how do you ensure people can receive those rights? Now, in the UK system, in the Welsh system, it's a legally enforceable right at the individual level. But what you also then need to have is lesson learning and implementation beyond the individual. So systematic level learning, which is what would happen under a traditional right to housing. And that's one of our biggest challenges in Wales, is that we lack a regulator of this system. So we might get individual household level challenge, but we're not getting the systematic wide challenge and support that local authorities, who are the implementers of this legislation and this right, we're not getting the enforcement by some sort of regulatory body. And that, in a number of studies that I've undertaken recently, is one of the key messages. And that's not that we didn't ask for it at the time, it just never got implemented. So having oversight, having a champion and a regulator, for me, is a key lesson for any right to housing. Who is going to champion it and ensure that it's enacted? When we talk about right to housing, one of the key concepts is progressive realisation. So it's not like you bring in a right to housing, everyone has to have a house, or even a home. And that's actually one of the challenges, is governments can say, we have a right to housing, we're on the journey to realising that because we've got a housing strategy. That's useless, right? That doesn't get us far enough, quick enough. But this concept of progressive realisation is that we're on our journey towards the realisation of this right to housing. What we implemented in Wales was what was achievable. We brought in the law at a time of major austerity. It was being developed in 2012. And it basically brought in a duty to take reasonable steps. Not an absolute duty to provide accommodation, but a duty to take reasonable steps to prevent or relieve homelessness, the realisation of a right to housing. But it was achievable, and it's what you can do within the resources that you have at the time. That's a really good, what we found is that's a really good first stepping point, and a concrete stepping point, far more so than insisting on a housing strategy. Because now what we're realising, we've just conducted a further review of the legislation, and now there is appetite for an absolute right to housing that's legally enforceable. So local authorities wouldn't just be under a duty to take reasonable steps, but under a duty to house. anybody at risk of or who is already homeless. And it's that progressive realization and concrete steps towards it that's been so important. And I think that I've always said, the idea of reasonable steps is enforceable as much in Wales as it is in Somaliland, in Hargeisa, or wherever. It's within that context. And then the final point is, I would say, if you're going to enforce it through a legally enforceable right at the individual level, as we do in the UK, avoid problematic bureaucracies. There is such a thing as a good bureaucracy, but we've got to avoid being overly bureaucratic and burdensome, and allowing and enabling local authorities to act, with looking at the needs of the individual and the household, rather than under some sort of very bureaucratic system that doesn't allow them that mobility and fluidity. What we're talking about here is change. In whichever country or even city level that we're trying to implement this, you're talking about change. And we did that in Wales. And I don't think we thought through the change management particularly well. And that certainly come from my reflections on our change with colleagues in Canada and elsewhere, is that we didn't think through that process particularly well. It happened kind of organically, but there was a lot of change in staffing within the system. A lot of people had to leave housing and homelessness services, because we were moving towards a very different system that was about finding solutions. And I think if we're going to bring in a right to housing, there has to be a plan for how you bring about that kind of service and culture change at whatever level across government.